The last conversation was incredibly insightful. The panelists talked about some of the very tangible things that are happening on the ground in China to improve food safety. This next panel is going to take it up a level and talk about what our respective governments are doing to facilitate trade and improve food safety between China and the U.S. And then we'll also talk about the role of the private sector in engaging in these conversations and being additive to this discussion. Our moderator for this panel is Bill Westman. Bill is the North American Meat Institute's Senior VP of International Affairs and a board member of the U.S.-China Agriculture and Food Partnership. He served for nearly 30 years in USDA's Foreign Ag Service, including a stint in Beijing, where he was responsible for the overall supervision and management of the organization's largest overseas operation. Bill, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Trace. I think we have a great panel here before you this morning. Very quickly, the Meat Institute has been working for 8-9 years now to try to develop a relationship with the China Meat Association, our counterpart. And within the context of the AFP, the idea was to where can we work together in terms of food safety? Where can we work together in terms of food security? And how can we help advance the dialogue between the governments? And how can we all work together in a public and private sector arrangement? So Jerry and Todd, Ken, Carmen, thanks for being here. We hope that we'll have some time after the remarks to take some questions from the audience and see what your interest is. So without further ado, Jerry, why don't you get us started here?
So again, my name is Jerry Flint, and I work for the company Corteva. And I'm going to talk to you about that first, because Corteva may be a new company name for most of you in the room. But September of last year, two large companies merged, Dow and DuPont. We refer to the company now as Dow DuPont, but the intention is to split that new company, Dow DuPont, into three independent companies. And so our intended spin is next June. The agriculture piece of that merger is called Corteva, and we announced that company name, or that division name, which will become the company name, back in February. And Corteva is a combination of two words. Cor means heart, and Teva means nature. So the heart of nature is the core of our new agriculture division, and the intended company that'll be spun off in June of next year. And the reason that's important for this topic is because that's the essence of what this new company will become, where food security, food systems, understanding where we're going to operate within those food systems globally is a key thing that we're talking about as we stand up this division and eventually become its own company. One of the things that, as I come into Corteva, and my role is leading our global initiatives and sustainability work, which also includes agriculture development. And that's very much centered around food security, food safety, and food systems. And we're looking at that globally, and we're looking at that in a way, where can we position ourselves as a new company in a different way than where we have been in the past. So that's the intention going forward. In the program, there were a couple of statements that were sent out to kind of provoke our thinking a little bit. And one of the things that I want to talk about is some of the cooperation, the opportunities for cooperation. And in my history in the industry, I've seen some very real and good examples of how public-private partnerships can work out in a very positive way. And one of the things that I'd like for you to think about is when you think of some of those public-private partnerships that have benefited both the U.S. and China, there are some very good examples. They have one thing in common, and it was actually mentioned on the first panel. It's called trust. Trust and transparency and the ability to communicate. And our experiences in those partnerships has been one where you really have to spend a lot of time up front developing the communication cadence, the trust, and the transparency, and then make sure that you're aligned on common outcomes. We have a couple of examples in China where we have some very nice joint venture partners. We have some collaborations with universities that are successful in terms of bringing new innovations in China for China. We also see the other piece of it come through where when we develop good partnerships, there are business opportunities that come up in the U.S. as well. And so those are some of the things that I think as we continue the dialogue today is to think about how we can do more of that. One of the examples I want to bring forward is the role of trade associations in that work. So as the Ag and Food Partnership is one of them, I participate in several others. One of them is the American Seed Trade Association. And we started, I've been working with the American Seed Trade Association over 20 years, and we started an effort in the early 2000s when China wanted to upgrade the seed industry in China. So seed companies in China operating in China, developing and producing seeds for farmers for use in China. And we did that through our international cooperative program, through American Seed Trade Association. We also started working through International Seed Federation and the China National Seed Association as well in China. And over the course of the last decade, and it has been a long time, but we've seen tremendous progress in terms of how the countries have not only improved their dialogue, but in the case within China, now the upgrading of some seed laws, which will help add to professionalism within the seed industry in China. A lot of what the speakers in the previous panels were talking about from a food systems perspective. We're going to start to see that on the seed side. Now, we're not there yet. We're not completely done. But we have taken a pretty giant step forward, in my professional opinion, in terms of getting the two countries aligned on the outcomes that they're trying to achieve in terms of what the seed structure, the seed businesses should look like in China. Ultimately, that means higher quality seed products, higher quality grains and vegetables produced within China. And it feeds into some of the blockchain work that was discussed on the earlier panel. So I'm pretty excited about that. Again, it does take time. I think that the role of trade associations in what we're trying to do are pretty important. And because that's a pre-competitive space for the companies that participate in them. And I want to challenge the group today to think about how we can forge some of those relationships through our trade associations and promote some of that country-to-country bilateral dialogue through trade associations.
Very good. Thanks, Jerry. You know that your comment on common outcomes makes me think of how we started with China Meat Association to try to figure out where within their work and the 5-year plan and the new food safety law, where could we fit in and work together? So I like that term, common outcomes. So I think we should emphasize that. Todd, Tyson, obviously very active.
Yeah.
In China and in trade, so perhaps you can give some of your insights.
No, it's great to be here. Thanks to Walmart, the AFP, thanks to Georgetown. I'm Todd Menotti. I work in the Washington office for Tyson Foods, so I do kind of the trade policy piece for us. I don't do the actual trading, but our guys are, of course, Tyson is a major exporter of beef, protein, beef, pork, chicken, prepared foods across the world. We probably export to about 130 markets in a given year. And in FY17, our export sales were about 12%, represent about 12% of sales. So that pie is going to grow if everything goes well, and it's certainly China's part of that plan. When you look at the growing middle classes in China and around the world, that's where we want to be as well. So we predominantly operate in the U.S. still. We do have some operations in China, have some in India, but we're basically a U.S. company, so we're basically an exporter. And I'd say that, you know, working with AFP, China Meat, NAMI, we were probably one of the poster children for this kind of effort because we were out of the beef market for, what was it, almost 14, 15 years after the BSE incident. And China went from a very small beef market over that period of time to now, I think the estimates say about 2.5 billion with a lot of headroom to grow. So that's the good news. The bad news is we've already got a lot of competitors in China. Canada and Brazil, Argentina, others, Uruguay. So they've already got a foothold. So we had a lot of work to do. So, we worked for years. Bill was part of this. Everyone was part of this, getting the China market back open to U.S. beef. And it was one of the major starting points of the Trump administration. We were pleased to be on the top of that agenda. And, in that initial dialogue, 100 days, whatever you want to call it, a lot of work had already been done across several administrations. A lot of work was done in the previous administration, but Trump administration took it up, got across the line, and we got a partial market opening. And I'm going to emphasize partial, and it's great news. Look, we first and foremost wanted to be back in that market. The way we view it at Tyson is we've got, the world's best product on the beef side, along with some of our other U.S. competitors. And if we can get in a market, people are going to like our product. It's safe, it's high quality, and we're going to win. But first, you got to get in, and so that was a huge step. But I think, when you look at a couple of challenges ahead and opportunities for collaboration and partnership, you get to certainly the 30 months, which is pretty typical around beef trade these days. But the animal ID program, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second, and then certainly, the ban on beta agonists or any other animal health agents. So those are areas when you look at the kind of work that AFP does and the kind of business-to-business work between the two countries, educating folks about what we do, what the expectations are for food safety in China. These are ultimately government-to-government negotiations. We don't fancy ourselves the negotiators, but we want to be there to bolster what our government is doing every day and hopefully very soon on all these issues. So these are great opportunities. And I would just say, since the market's been opened, we've seen great success. We see a lot of interest in our product. But look, there's just not that much cattle available. The reality is Tyson probably, from a U.S. packer perspective, was probably in the best position in terms of cattle, because we already had we have a nature-raised program, and these cattle, working with producers, are raised to the standards that meet Europe and China. So we already had some cattle available, but it wasn't that much, and the limitations are pretty real right now. I'll just give a quick statistic about that. From January to March 2018, the U.S. industry exported over 1,500 metric tons of beef to mainland China. Compare that to over 61,000 metric tons to Japan for the same time period. So when you look at the opportunity we have, it's pretty big. And I would just call out the animal ID area as an area that we hope to continue seeing some discussion. And hopefully in these talks that are emerging out of the recent bilateral negotiations that look like they're going to continue. So we would love to be a part of that. We think the animal ID program is high integrity. We think the third-party verification program that comes with that is high integrity. And this basically, of course, traces back that cattle back to its point of origin, so that if there is any animal health issue, that we can immediately do that. But there are ways, if we could put some flexibility in that system, using group ID and other types of things that are a little less expensive, then we could bring, I know at Tyson, we could bring more cattle immediately into the market. And again, I think the key for China and the key for the opportunity here is to get that price point to a place that doesn't put too much pressure on getting a premium in China. We want to put our product in China. We think it's going to succeed there, but it's more expensive right now. It's more expensive to contract with our cattle producers to get the kind of meet those requirements. So as we look at this discussion today and then look at hopefully the government-to-government discussions, I think that's where I see a lot of opportunity on the beef side. And let me put a plug in for poultry, my other hat. We can certainly get that market open, I think, very easily, get the AI restrictions lifted, and get more U.S. protein into China. So thanks a lot. Great to be here.
Thanks, Todd. I think this note about opportunities for collaboration is something we all strive for and we all work for, regardless of whether it's private sector or government or through AFP or individually. So that's something we will continue to explore and hopefully get some answers today. Ken, OSI, I mean, tremendous activity in China and around the world. Perhaps folks don't know a lot about OSI. Maybe you could talk a little bit about it so they get a reference point there.
Okay.
Well, good morning, and thanks everybody for coming. Thanks very much to our hosts. It's always good to see like-minded friends who travel or live in China. As Bill said, OSI is really, I guess, kind of the company behind the brand. We've been in the business since 1909, and in 1955 we sold the first hamburger to what would become the largest global quick service restaurant. I won't say who they are, but I will say I'm loving it. And then followed that company around the planet and diversified our business so that now we operate 65 roughly food-producing plants in 17 countries. We distribute into 80 countries. And as I suggested, we're really the name behind the brand. So we don't do transactional sales. We produce for large either regional or international companies. Primarily a further processor. Of our 65 plants, 10 are slaughter facilities, beef slaughter in Europe, and chicken slaughter in US, Australia, and China. So we've been in China with that customer since 1991. And interestingly, I guess if you look at today's world, we're actually a wholly owned foreign company in China. And began producing right after that in 1992. We, over the years, either operated or built 10 food-producing facilities in China. We serviced the 2008 Beijing Olympics. And as we grew, as China started to evolve, better articulate their food safety concepts, in 2009, we significantly expanded our interest in China, and long story short, over the last 25 years, we've invested about $1 billion US. I guess, what would that be, about 15 billion RMB in China. Most of that since 2009, when we significantly went into vertically integrated poultry operations. Because at the time, we had decreased reliability on our supply chain controls in China. So given our customer base, we needed more stability, more predictability in our, in that case, our chicken supply chain. As I said, build a fully integrated chicken operation from breeders to layers to hatcheries to grow out to slaughter and further processing. More predictability both on pricing and, of course, on supply. And so that's kind of been helped us then engage with China officials, which I think I'll spend most of my time on. We are not a big exporter. We tend to produce, we distribute in the markets where we produce. Very limited exports, typically to another market to service an existing customer. So we have long-term relationships in the countries we're operated in. As I said, China since 1991. And so we spend a lot of time interacting with China industry officials, other peers, and increasingly the China government to engage on what we think are relevant global food safety principles. And as everybody knows, in 2015, China finalized their food safety law. To their credit, they have a single food safety law, like most governments in the world. Unlike the US system that has a collage of multiple regulations or multiple legislations that authorize different parts of the food chain in the US. The advantage of the US system is that the roles and responsibilities of the industry and the government are pretty well understood. Nothing's perfect, but who is responsible for what, and the regulatory consequences, the legal consequences are pretty well understood through legislation, through regulatory activity, through case law. It's pretty well ironed out in the US. That is one of our views of where China needs to get to. More predictability in their food safety system, and we've talked to them about this. We've heard the word transparency. That is a big one. I would argue, as a reformed regulator, equity of regulatory activity, equity of enforcement. to include central accountability, which is, in my view, not existing today. Central accountability of regulatory policy decision-making needs to improve in China. Up until very, very recently, there's, in my view, too much deference to some large local municipal areas to generate their own kind of regulatory approaches. So Beijing needs to assume more accountability to both triage and support good decisions and overturn bad decisions. And as China, so we spent a lot of time interacting with our kind of three main government prongs would be China FDA, the AQSIQ, which is import and export, and then a group called CNCA, which is an accreditation and certification authority. In the last, 60 days, all of those have been morphed into a new state administration of market regulation. And so there is a lot of uncertainty as the players from the existing parts of the organization, as those players find homes in this new state administration of market regulation. And so we're interested in seeing how that plays out. I think unification is a good idea to get more unification of, as I said, central regulatory approaches. That also they're putting forward for what I think is the first time where the Communist Party is assuming better authority, better control of policy, in this case, food policy. So the new state administration of market regulation has a political arm, the former head of CFDA, Mr. B, and then more of a kind of an execution, arm, if you will. So I think that's kind of the right approach. We talked to them about how inspection could work in China, as they talk about things they refer to as inspection teams. With the people tends to go the funding, tends to go the accountability, which tends to go the resources. So there is some competition for, I guess we'll say, power in China on who owns the inspection workforce, what they'll call inspection teams. So we've shared some of the U.S. experience. The U.S. is not China, but we've learned some lessons the hard way, where from everything from foodborne outbreaks where you've had people sick or dead, going way back to certainly the late 90s into the 2000s, a variety of, as we heard earlier, some 0157 outbreaks, listeria outbreaks. Shared with our China friends what that did and how that helped drive some regulatory activity. So they can perhaps understand what we learned and what we changed as a consequence of those events, so that they can contextualize those issues into their new system. None of us wants any other government to repeat the challenges we had. They have their own challenges, and certainly they can learn from those. So through all of that with the government, we interact with other partners. AFP is important, has important relationships with the China government. China Institute of Food Science and Technology has different relationships with the China government. We've interacted with China veterinary associations on antibiotic reductions, principles that we'd like to see pursued in China. And so everything is in evolution. We saw some data earlier on the current risks in China, which are primarily from their perspective around the drug and pesticide, environmental pesticide end of the spectrum, which takes us back to really the 60s, maybe the 1970s in the US. So they're in a different part of the evolutionary cycle with chemical risk being predominant. Of course, most Western countries, it's more of a microbial risks today. But some of the fundamental principles are the same, and kind of final comment, we're encouraging them to think systematically. You do not have to regulate everything. In fact, if you regulate the process, you will stymie industry innovation, which was something the US learned going back to the mid-90s. And to focus on science-based outcomes. All that said, having heard some of the visions of the new organization, which is linked to the China FDA organization, they talk about, and even from President Xi, being a powerful enforcement and strong regulation. So in there, I think, are some principles that they should think about as they entertain improving their food safety system in China, But as they further pursue actually being a recognized player in the global food safety framework, as having a government structure and a regulatory regime and industry beyond that demonstrates they understand what principles of safe food production are. So that's
Again, thank you. Makes me think back to when we had conversations with officials there about science-based decision-making and science-based standards and so forth. And talking to, I think it was from AQSIQ, we sat there and he paused for a moment. He looked at me and says, well, you know, maybe our science is different than yours. But think about that statement. I mean, and the diet and how food is produced and distributed and so forth. So actually thought about that for a week, that statement, and came around that, yes, okay, maybe there are some differences here that we're not taking into consideration. So I think these areas of working together and so forth, I think very important. And someone mentioned before, not only trust, but communication, which brings us to USDA. And it's really, Carmen, glad you could join us. And just for everyone's knowledge, congratulations again, now Administrator of the Food Safety and Inspection Service.
Thank you.
We, in representing the meat industry, obviously work very closely with you and your staff, and we appreciate your support and collaboration with us. So one last comment is that, you know, all of us here, probably Jerry too included, we want to work together to help you do your job in terms of your negotiations and interaction with Chinese officials and how best to work together to improve not only the relationship but improve trade and so forth. So you have the floor. So thanks for coming.
Thank you. Thanks, Bill. Thanks to Walmart and thanks to the Meat Institute for inviting me here today. This is a really nice opportunity to be here with you all and talk about the regulatory side, sort of the work that we do on an international stage. And in hearing the previous remarks, you probably have really picked up on the fact that as a regulatory agency, we actually play a really central role in these trade discussions, which is interesting because we, as a government, keep trade and regulatory authority very separate from each other. So I'll maybe talk to you a little bit about how the agency is set up and in Department of Agriculture, how we look at trade and how we come at these issues, and then maybe refer back to a few things that my colleagues have discussed. So Food Safety and Inspection Service, we have regulatory authority over meat, poultry, processed eggs. Everything else, all the other food is over at Health and Human Services with FDA. And in USDA, we have the Food Safety and Inspection Service as a regulatory agency. Animal Plant Health Inspection Service is another regulatory agency on the live animal side and plant side. And then we have the newly created Trade and Foreign Agricultural Affairs Office. We've always had the Foreign Ag, or for a very long time have had a Foreign Agricultural Service, where Bill Westman served many, many years in his career. But he's not here to talk on that side today. So we have these different pillars set up where you have the regulators separated from the trade folks. And the regulators get pulled in often on discussions related to imports and exports. Imports, because we want to ensure the safety of the product, and we have authority over making equivalency determinations, which in the US requires rulemaking and can be a very lengthy process. And on exports, we are at the table as technical experts. Food safety, is really the underpinning for this global economy, ensuring that systems have credible food safety systems. And so we are brought to the table for the exports in terms of ensuring that we have export health certificates that meet the importing country's requirements, that any additional requirements that are above and beyond what the US requires, we can work with our partners in the marketing and regulatory programs to set up these export verification programs. And when we look at trade barriers that continue even after markets are opened, which I think is some of what you've heard up here today, at least from Tyson's, I just want to go into that a little bit more because, the press says, China has now opened the door for beef from the US. And while that's true, and anytime that we have a good trade story, you'll see it in the press, But what you don't often see in the press is the very lengthy documents that are in what we have on our export library, which is publicly available. It's on our website. It's very voluminous for other countries' requirements for food coming from the US. And it, in effect, creates barriers to trade from American producers. Oftentimes, the barriers are not based on any kind of scientific standards or on codex standards, on recognized OIE standards. They're really items that a country has put in place for either as a protectionist purpose, or because there's some concerns that they have internally. And when Bill talks about their science is different than ours, they may have had a different experience with a certain thing that leads them to think that this is the only way that we're going to be able to get safe product into the country. And so a lot of the work that we do, I'm administrator for the agency, and I'm acting deputy undersecretary until we have an undersecretary that's nominated and confirmed by the Senate. We have one that's nominated, but just not one that's confirmed yet. And really the role of that position and some of our technical experts is to go and meet in other countries, to have face-to-face dialogue with countries about the safety of the food supply. And those are really important conversations. You know, the most important connection is that human connection. Regardless of all of the technology and innovation, you still need to have face-to-face conversations with your regulatory counterparts. And that's something that I think at FSIS we do quite well. Maybe those on the stage could tell you whether we do it well or not. But it is really critical in having any kind of agreement set up with another country because you, as regulators, we bring something different to the table. It's not a trade perspective. And so I have a philosophy that when we are going to the table as FSIS, as Food Safety and Inspection Service, with another country's regulators, we go by ourselves. We don't take industry with us. We don't take trade associations with us. But what we do is we really rely very heavily on industry and trade associations to tell us what the issues are, what are the barriers, so that we can determine where the science is on that particular issue. And this comes up all the time on a weekly basis. We have issues with some product that's stuck at port in another country. And we, as regulators and scientists in FSIS, are working backward to try to figure out where the issue is. And sometimes it is an industry issue, a legitimate industry issue, but there are many times in which it's either a barrier to trade, non-tariff trade barrier, or there is a misunderstanding about the science on which a country is relying to make a determination about the product. And so who goes there to sort these things out? It's really the role of the regulators to go and meet and say this food is safe. It was safe when we left here. It's safe when it arrives there. And so this is an important work that we do, but we do it in constant collaboration with industry and trade associations, especially where there are issues that arise that we find and that we need to get information out quickly to the whole entire industry. The trade associations are absolutely key in helping us get that information out. And so I think that we have a very good collaboration there. When Ken was talking about the new food safety law in China, we had an opportunity in FSIS to have many conversations and dialogue with their regulators on how the USDA system or how the US system is set up, particularly around meat and poultry, in terms of how we do inspection and how the actual enforcement and compliance piece is set up. And we are seeing already some of the influence that those years of conversations had, both with CFDA and with AQSIQ. And so just one last thing that I'll say, and is everyone here from industry, or do we have students? Everybody's industry? Any consumer groups? So sometimes you'll hear, or there will be media reports about, there are some big agreement for, your beef, for U.S. beef or China beef, or U.S. poultry for China poultry. And I think it's important to sort of address that. We do not have a system that's based on quid pro quo at all. We have very separate trade from regulators. And I think that where it comes in of the timing of certain agreements or certain technical discussions that are going on, the U.S. government never offers up anything that hasn't been thoroughly evaluated and audited. We have, for our equivalency process, we have a three-prong approach to in-country audits that we conduct from 1 to 3 years. We do a thorough, every year, document review from the importing country, and then we do point of entry verification. So where we find things at point of entry, we may ramp up our point of entry inspection, may need to go over to the country and do another audit. But I just will leave you with that the U.S. government takes food safety extremely seriously, and we have a system set up whereby we have a really rigid protocol in place to make those equivalency determinations. So,
Great. Thank you, Carmen.
thank you.
Perhaps I can follow up real quick with each of you, and then I think we would like to open it up to the audience for Q&A and give you a chance to ask some questions that you may have an interest in. Jerry, you've done a lot of work on the technology side in China. What do you think is consumer acceptance of these new technologies? Because obviously we think China could benefit from some of these things in terms of not only intensive land use, but use of water, the ability to produce more on less land and so forth. But what's your reaction to consumer acceptance of these technologies?
Yeah, thank you. And just as a bit of history in my background, I had an assignment in Asia Pacific from 2005 to 2008, traveled extensively in China, all throughout Asia, India, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand. So I've been working in China. My first trip to China was in 1998. So I have worked in the region pretty extensively. One of the things, when I get out in the provinces and we get out into where the production is actually occurring, there's some pretty strong innovation occurring even at the smallholder farmer level. And so what we've seen from a grower perspective in China, evaluating new ways to produce, evaluating new markets to access, evaluating new ways to look at their operations. And we've seen that throughout the food chain. As that's starting to occur and things are getting more sophisticated, we're starting to see that. What's not always translating is how consumers then perceive that. And I think China is facing a reality much like we are in the US, where a significant part of the population is no longer tied directly to the farm. So it's not always easy for a consumer to understand how the food was produced. Our previous panel issued that. So one of the things that we've done as a company and through our cooperation with China is actually try to tell that story better in China. And we've had a lot of great cooperative programs with USDA where we're trying to do some of those bilaterals and talk about how we talk to consumers. And it's different than it is in the US. So every country is a little bit different in terms of what consumers are, the questions that they're asking. And so over the past few years, we've had a number of cooperative programs bilaterally in China to try to do that on the grain side in particular. But that's going to continue to be important because one of the previous panel members showed WeChat. So social media in China is reality. And so with that comes some challenges in terms of how information is disseminated and sometimes the accuracy of that information. So that's a reality in China. So to sum that up, I think that technology is real. And I think farmers are willing to adopt new technologies. Consumers, I think we have a bit of a challenge in terms of communicating to consumers in terms of how the food systems in China actually work.
That's great. Thanks, Sheriff. Todd, you talked a little bit about the beef market. Obviously, there's a great deal of interest. I think, in my opinion, you're absolutely right in terms of the growth in disposable income, the growth of middle class. As people have more disposable income, they try to shift to a higher quality protein. Good example was last week we were at the CL show in Shanghai, working out of the U.S. Meat Export Federation booth, and whenever they brought out some beef, it was just a mob scene. And so
That's good.
it was just really tremendous demand. I mean, how do you see this market evolving? I mean, e-commerce is becoming more and more important. It's becoming a lot easier to use.
No,
How do you see the market transitioning
I think
here?
our guys are open to a lot of different avenues. And it's still about 80%. So about the way we define it, it's about 80% food service right now. So when you think about what you sell over there, it usually goes through food service channels. It's hot pot, Korean barbecue, and those types of things. And that's going to stay, a very popular way to do it. But we're also, very interested in retail cuts. And we think over time, and again, it's all about, you just sort of see this all around the world as you have rising middle classes, people's tastes change just a little bit. It happens here. You'll get an interest and an education about these different cuts. And so, for instance, in the Sam's Clubs, there we do have we have retail cuts. We have some of that in Costco as well. I think we're very open to growing these different channels. It's and e-commerce is just rapidly growing. So we're already doing a little of that, I believe, but I think you're going to see in probably 5 years you're going to see much more of that rising up. So it's exciting. We would call the growth, it's slow but steady. It's not sort of out of control or anything in terms of the growth, but it's the trend line is very good for beef. It's going to outpace the growth in pork and chicken consumption, which we want to continue the chicken consumption. Don't get me wrong.
Right.
But it's going to be good. It's a very positive outlook.
I mentioned WeChat. This is really quite amazing. Some of our friends and partners there, they just do everything on their phone with WeChat. I mean, they pay their rent, they go to supermarket, restaurants, everything. It's quite amazing. Ken, we've talked a little bit about the food safety law and this sort of division of responsibilities, if you will, between the federal government and the municipalities. How do you see that? Is there any roadmap in the new food safety law that will better define that, or how do you see that going forward?
Well, in the food safety law, then written, CFDA was authorized to assume that role. And so we were looking to see them assume that role. Of course, there's a long history in China that other people here could articulate better than I on the role, the power of certain municipalities compared to Beijing. And so from a food safety perspective, I think they do need to move beyond that. And I think the way to move beyond that one way is to demonstrate that they're in control. And so, which gets back to partly what I was saying about some hierarchical decision making. Just because a large municipality makes some decision, that should not be the be-all and end-all, and industry should have some avenue to appeal. Now, again, the legal system, the judicial system in China is not the same as the U.S., but appeals processes are advantageous, in my view, both to the government and to industry. Government learns that, gee, we thought this was going on and it's really not going on, or gee, we thought this was clear and it's not, so there is a benefit there. And it also helps reinforce to the lower tiers of the workforce, here's how you think about this particular problem. So that's, I won't say long-term, but at least kind of a mid-term approach, but they need to execute that responsibility, and there's never a shortage of opportunities in any food country to demonstrate that you're in control. And in control doesn't mean we slammed them and we're powerful. It's articulating the thinking behind a particular issue in a coherent way, and people can look at it and go, wow, that's thoughtful, we get it, we can comply with that, instead of a more personality-based approach to food regulation, which is, as Carmen suggested, that's not how it works, certainly not in the codex scheme of things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it makes me think of when we finally were able to build the trust, and we've talked about trust this morning with China Meat Association in terms of where the needs were, and it was a situation where we were not saying, well, this is how we do it, you're going to need to do it this way, is how do we adapt these concepts and these food safety concepts to what the reality is in China. And I think, Carmen, it gets back to certainly this issue of equivalency and how that works. And it seemed to me that there was a lot of time spent educating Chinese regulators about equivalency and what that means and how it's defined. And I don't know if you have a comment about how that works with foreign governments and from FSIS's perspective.
Everyone thinks it takes too long, regardless of what government we're talking about. I think the conversations about equivalency are important because if we're going to acknowledge that another country is equivalent, I mean, countries around the world think of the US standard as the gold standard for equivalency, and so sometimes countries seek equivalence not because they're going to ship here, but because they want to have that mark of approval from the US government. And it is because we have a robust system. For initial equivalence, it takes more than one audit. It takes rulemaking, and when I say rulemaking, it's notice and comment rulemaking, where we publish a proposed rule once we've completed an audit and believe that a country has an equivalent level of food safety protection. And then the public can comment on that proposed rule. In the case of China poultry, we had a public comment period that closed at the very end of the summer. And then as regulators, we have to review those comments and then put a final rule together that goes through the highest levels of our government in order to be published as a final rule. Then once you have equivalency, you have to ship product to the United States or you become inactive and you'd have to be reinstated. Reinstatement does not require a formal rulemaking again, but it does require additional audits and additional reports and corrective actions and all of that. So once a country is found to be equivalent, then they ship product to the US. We do point of entry testing and sampling. We do 100% point of entry reinspection for all product. But that's, much of that is condition of container and ensuring certificates and labels are accurate. And we do a smaller percentage of sampling. But we also have the ability then, when we do find something that's incoming that's problematic, and I think our standing up the catfish inspection program was a perfect example of this. When we do find issues, we intensify the sampling we can do it by country or we can do it by a certain establishment. And then requiring additional documentation from those establishments. So it's an ongoing process, our equivalency process is, and we require it of every country. So there are some developed nations that don't require it from all countries because once they find you equivalent, then they don't need to do all this additional work. In the US, we treat all countries the same in terms of the equivalence process. And I think once countries hear that and we can show how long it has taken for other countries, then people think, okay, well, it's not just us, And I think for China, that's been one of the biggest hurdles really to overcome is to explain to them that this is a process and these processes do take time. But we have a very good relationship with our regulatory counterparts in China. And as a result of that, we've built trust over the years.
That's great, thank you. I think one of the things we went through in this whole process was understanding the timelines and deadlines that you have to go by because there's regulations there and deadlines.
Right.
And that was not understood when something was finished. It's like, okay, we did that, but then 12 months went by and says, oh, we have to do this again. What do you mean? We did it already.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of, and I think what few people understand is that there's very few countries that are eligible to export poultry to the United States.
No, that's absolutely true. And also, it's a situation of when we have technical experts come to the table with our technical experts to have these conversations about the equivalency process, I think what happens is, if Ken's my boss, I go to Ken and say, oh, they just have to come over and audit us. And I'm not telling Ken the next 10 steps that will come after that. And when we tell our counterparts, the US government puts everything on the website related to the equivalency process. Everything is there. All of our documents, our guidance documents to our own industry, our directives and notices to our own employees, it's all on our website. And so when we have countries, and China has definitely come to us and asked us for, well, can we see, would you be willing to share with us X? Yeah, it's on the website, but here it is, and being able to show that because we are transparent in terms of our processes.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have a couple of minutes. I think we'd like to open it up to the audience. Don't be shy. We've got some experts up here. Would love to answer your questions if we can. So, Jessica in the back, yes. Speak up loud.
Jessica Wasserman and Associates, and formerly FAS. And congratulations, Carmen, and thank you for your many years of answering my questions about labeling. But I wanted to ask, the McDonald's guy, OSI. So, you know, in China, the U.S. Food industry has enjoyed such a benefit in terms of branding, you know, I think because of the history of food safety, but the interest and demand for U.S. branded products has always been good. I just wonder if you think that is something that we will maintain for a very long period of time into the future, or whether you think that's at risk in general.
I don't know if that it's at risk, though we do see, and actually, well, let me back up. Part of what we've done, obviously working with this customer, is when we go into a country, is also working with like-minded companies to come into that supply chain. Mm-hmm. So we have developed some companies in China that have now supplanted, you know, these are China origin companies that have now supplanted some of our market share. That's kind of how it works. And so they've upped their game, but we think anybody, when the boats are floating in food safety, you know, that's the right direction. If you're standing still, you're retreating. So that capacity building has been beneficial. But we're also seeing it in some of the QSR market in China. Some pretty sophisticated companies, as Bill mentioned, that just kill us in the digital world, are now not just in one or two cities, but now we're becoming the in the multiple tier 1 cities and then becoming more and more sophisticated. They may track to a different supply chain than ours. So I don't know if it's so much supplanting the US kind of competency, though we do get a lot of mileage out of that. You know, we're competent not because we just say we are, because here's 8 things I'm doing that maybe you're not. And I can demonstrate that I am, you know, executing that. So we need to maintain our competency, but just the nature of, you know, a country would be becoming more modern, both on the restaurant end as well as the producing end. They are naturally supplanting some of ours. I don't know that the China customer so much cares. They should expect safe food that's nutritious wherever they go, and if they're getting it from a China company that's, you know, the right price, fine. If they're getting it from a US-based company that's the right price, you know, I think that's fine to them as well. So I see it more as an evolutionary rather than just a displacement kind of issue.
Okay, next question. Fritz, don't put your head down. Really, any questions from the audience? It's your opportunity.
Made me.
No, I'm not going to let you just sit there, Fritz, okay?
No, there's been talk for a long time, Carmen, about FSIS actually having an office in Beijing. Could you tell us what the status is?
Yeah,
so we
great
have,
question.
Okay.
Yes. So, and I have exciting news to share on the status. We have been working for quite some time to get an office up and running there in the embassy and have an FSIS, a senior FSIS person there. And we just made a selection of Karen Becker, who was the director of our epidemiology staff in our Office of Public Health Science. And she will be going there for a year, and that may be extended, but she's going to start out with a year there, and we're really excited to have her. We have relied over the years really significantly on the APHIS person who's in that office, as well as FAS carrying our messages. But it's when the markets are opened in either direction, you have a need to have somebody there in country who can answer those questions and take those meetings and not have to fly out on a moment's notice, as I've had to do over the last couple of years. So yeah, so we're excited. So Karen Becker, and we're hoping that she'll be over there in July.
That's great news.
Yeah.
To have someone on the ground,
Right.
that really is very, very important.
Bill, can I follow up on that because
Yes.
that's great news. And you know, as we've worked in China and other countries as well, we're very fortunate in China because our FAS staff, the USDA staff in our embassy, particularly in Beijing, for a number of years has been just incredible. And you know, we need to help continue to support that because it's been very. It's not always easy. You know, you mentioned the technical issues that can become artificial trade barriers. USDA has been phenomenal about identifying those, bringing the right scientists together, and really working on that, not only in China, but other countries as well. So to see that continue, in my opinion, is a really key development and something we need to help support.
Well, and I think it's easy just to say, oh, this is just an artificial trade barrier. But it's a lot harder for another country and another regulator to look across the table at you and tell you that what they're doing is based on science when you have science that to show them and data to show them that doesn't support it. And so we have had great success. And having the folks in country, I mean, FAS Beijing has a very strong office, and they do support USDA across the whole world.
Okay, well, Carmen, Ken, Todd, Jerry, thank you so much for taking time of your day to be with us. Let's give them a round of applause, please.